Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to Reading Dungeons and Dragons Aloud. With me, historian, author, gadfly, man about town, Ben Riggs. And with me, as always, is the wizard of Wauwatosa, the weapon of mass instruction, the one, the only, Dr. Scott Michael Bruner.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Sorry, I feel like I really got into the WWE of that this morning.
That'd be nice. Yeah.
So, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day, good night, one and all. Um, if you are new to listening to this, because this will be posting just before Gen Con, so if you are at Gen Con and decided to give this show a listen, this is likely the first episode you're listening to. We take a long, deep dive on D&D and other role-playing game texts. We try and have luminous guests who will say things that you have never heard before. In some, we want to be Bible study for D&D fanatics. Anything else you think we should add to the scope of that, Dr. Bruner?
No, I think that's a good way to put it. I did want to ask you a question. Ben, do you mind saying what events you're doing at Gen Con? If people
Um,
wanted to meet you face to face.
Let me start with what I have pulled up on that topic and then pivot to that. So if you are at Gen Con or are going to Gen Con and hearing this a few days before, I wanted to point out that a panel, so Gen Con is looking to be a sellout crowd, and a lot of seminars are looking to be sellout seminars. And one that is not, that probably deserves to be, is at 10 a.m. on Saturday. Uh, Former Wizards of the Coast co-founder, I guess he still is the co-founder, former CEO and president and co-founder of Wizards of the Coast, Peter Adkison, is doing a seminar with John Peterson, the the Thucydides of TTRPG historians, and the designers of fourth edition Dungeons and Dragons, Rob Heinsoe and Andy Collins, in ICC 101 at 10 a.m. on Saturday. And if you have not heard the proper story of fourth edition, it's worth hearing from those guys. It's a great story. It's time well spent, so I'd highly recommend checking that out. As for me, it is with some hesitancy that I mention this because a lot of mine are sold out already. Um, and again, I got 200 person rooms, but it's still pretty looking pretty tight. So let me pull this up.
Yeah, I'm interested to know, and I told you yesterday that GaryCon badges had just gone on sale yesterday, and it was the first year that I put aside enough money to get a gold badge, and I thought there'd be no problem getting one. And I sat here, was ready to get my gold badge for GaryCon, and literally all the gold badges sold out in under a minute. I did not get a gold badge. I'll stick with my silver, which is fine, but I posted it to the Discord, and somebody had mentioned the appetite for Dungeons and Dragons cons is an all-time. This is from Ethan. And you talked about Gary Hole, Gen Con, and even Game Hole Con going gangbusters. Do you think that the
Sure, you
reason
called you called it Gary Hole.
I don't know if that's a terrible Freudian slip. I'm sorry, Mr. Sorry,
Please
Mr.
continue.
Geiger.
I'm sorry. That's awesome.
There should be, I don't even know what that convention would be like. Ugh. That's everybody probably doesn't know we're recording in the morning, but just the oh, that's just a word I didn't want to necessarily say out loud. It's 7 a.m. in the morning. Anyway, Game Hole Con in Madison, all the regional cons. But it's interesting. Like, do you think that the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons is having an impact on these cons, or is it just like, is Dungeons and Dragons literally at an all-time high?
So, first of all, I'm going to say that if you were the most persuasive argument against my whole the golden age is dead thing is the success of conventions. I had to update my the golden age of role playing games is dead thesis for Gen Con, and I found plenty of supporting evidence to kind of keep that trend going on the business side, on the publication side, but in what you would call the practice side, Dr. Bruner,
Hmm.
it is the opposite.
Sure.
Where if you look at, well, are people actually playing this game and are more people actually playing this game? It seems to indicate yes. There are 10 million accounts on D&D Beyond. Um, Now, obviously, like I have an account on D&D Beyond, and while I'm a role-playing gamer, I'm not playing D&D every week, but still, like that 10 million, I think, is a really useful round number. There were 10 million people that care enough about playing a D&D game that they made an account at some time. Um, and in a world of 10 million people that are that interested in playing D&D, it makes sense to me that you'd have Gen Con, which at capacity is probably 80,000 people, um, constantly selling out. I think that this year, the 50th anniversary is one of those things that brings people out of the woodwork and they kind of want to celebrate. So that might be a reason for the spike. But um,
Oh
we
yeah.
we are blissfully, and again, I can't believe this. We are on the flip side of the problems that the Harley Davidson Corporation is having. Um, where man, Harley Davidson is having again, we're in Milwaukee. Harley Davidson is here. They're having a hell of a time breaking into younger markets, oftentimes just because it's so damn expensive. A motorcycle costs a lot, and it's essentially a vanity purchase. That's like, a couple years of college, you're flushing down the toilet there to ride that Harley Davidson. So they're having a real hard time to get anybody under 30 doing that. Gosh, it was I think 80% of D&D players are under 40 and 60% are under 30. I'm pulling that out from marketing materials, but I just looked at them this week. You and I, Scott, are in the minority demographically of Dungeons and Dragons players at this point. We are a fifth. Over 40 people are one fifth of the D&D demographic. 80% is 39 or younger. There are
Mm.
about as many people playing D&D at our age as there are 19 and under, according to the marketing materials released by Wizards.
That's
Um,
interesting.
and when you think about that, like, those, if you're 35, um, you were not learning with the white box, you were not learning with the red box. If you came to it when you were young, you came to it with second edition. But that's unlikely. Vast majority of D&D players at this point came to D&D through fifth edition. It has never been bigger than it is now. It has never had the exponential growth that it had in the past 10 years. Um, so I think that what we're seeing is the blossoming, the flourishing of the practice of tabletop role-playing games. Stop me if I said this recently, Scott, but
Mm.
in I think 1999, Wizards released a marketing survey and they released their data from it. Um,
Yeah.
and it said if you play D&D over a year, you are more likely than not going to play it for the rest of your life. Like you might have times when you do, you might have times when you don't, but it's always going to be a thing you do.
The
And
first one's always free.
exactly.
Once they get their fangs in you, it's all
Yeah,
over.
yeah. But clearly, with millions of young people, D&D has been played by them for over a year, and they are now just like D&D players. Again, they might not be going to Gen Con, they might not be following every twist and turn, but they're like, well, I have to have my books because what if someone invites me to a pickup game and I don't have them? Um, and all of this is new and it's something that we oldsters I think are still adjusting to in many ways. Again, like when we reacted to the orc art, that could very well be, oh, we're here we are oldsters complaining about the way the kids are doing the new thing. Oh gosh, the Beatles are so loud and Elvis just keeps shaking his hips.
Well,
That could very well be it, that we're just old. um all right, do you want to say anything to that, or should I quickly list my seminars?
Well, I had one other last question about Gen Con, just because I'm interested, because I've never been in Gen Con. Again, that level of crowd kind of makes me feel a little strange. But at the same time, we were kind of talking about this last night that maybe we need to be at more cons. I mean, I know you're there, but it might be fun to be there together, and maybe it's something that I do need to check out. But my question is this: is I was looking at the Gen Con website as we were kind of chatting, and it looks more like I have been to San Diego Comic Con when I used to live in San Diego. And it was interesting is like how here's my question. Well, I have two questions because I do go to GaryCon and I feel like that's a grognardy. It used to, I mean, My gosh, it's getting so large. But I was gonna say it still has a bit of a grognardian flavor to it. It still has folks that did grow up, as you mentioned, like come into the game like I did through the from the Tom Moldvay or the Red Box set as well. I'm just curious when Gen Con has so many people going to these conventions. Well, the thing I was gonna say about San Diego Comic Con is like it became less a convention about comic books and more a convention about the subculture of like geek culture, right? There were more things at San Diego Comic Con that touched on movies and a lot of like the peripheral and not even movies necessarily about comics, literally like anything that had to do with like what we would I suppose call, geek culture, science fiction, fantasy, those types of things. That San Diego Comic Con was just kind of strange. It had, I think, long ago ceased to be anything about specifically around comic books. I'm curious how whether Gen Con still maintains a focus on tabletop role-playing games and games in general. It's so interesting to think, of course, that Gen Con is called Gen Con because the Gen stands for Lake Geneva, since this is a convention that Mr. Gygax started those millions and millions of years ago.
I would,
What's the vibe like at Gen Con?
wow. I mean, last year, um, during the load-in day, a couple guys stole an entire pallet of Magic the Gathering cards.
Hmm,
And it was a mini scandal the day before the con started, and of course in many ways it was an idiot crime because there's cameras everywhere. But that I feel in many ways is a apt summary of the convention and its cred.
yeah,
Like it's still it's so geeky and so big that uh, somebody at that convention thought they needed a pallet of Magic the
sure.
Gathering cards. Two, it's owned by again Peter Adkison, who was a co-founder of Wizards.
Yeah.
And in addition, again, he made his money, and Wizards made its money on Magic the Gathering, but he used that to buy D&D. He was a D&D fanatic. He is one of that first generation D&D players. He went to a Seventh-day Adventist college in College Station, Washington, and they were kicked off campus for being satanic, of course. So he got to play his D&D game in the late 1970s in his mom's basement on Saturday nights because even though she was a Seventh-day Adventist, she had much more realistic fears about what her son would get up to on a Saturday night than D&D.
Yeah.
She's like, well, if he's in the basement, what can he be doing? But when that guy is running the convention, it's I mean, it's so big. There's mini conventions essentially. Like again,
Yeah.
I'm in the Gen Con Writers Symposium this year, which is like probably a college semester in writing over 4 days. Like if you go to all of those seminars, you're gonna walk away with some ideas and plans about how to kickstart a writing career. Um, there is an entire film festival. There's an amazing dance on Saturday night. There's a costume contest, a costume parade, but still, with all of that, if you go into the halls and you go into the hotels and you go into those hotel seminar rooms, you're going to get seminars on tabletop role playing games and just thousands and thousands of people playing tabletop role playing games. And
Hmm.
again, it's not even like a pit at the center of a peach. Like, it's the peach. And everything else is the skin. And there's some amazing stuff on that skin, but really, uh, like one of my sadnesses is I really wanted this year. This year is the first time I'm going for 4 days since 2019 because pandemic and kid.
Sure.
Um, but I'm in the Gen Con Writers Symposium, so I kind of have to be there. And I was like, there's a room called Games on Demand where you just show up with a generic ticket and they have a menu of games and GM's ready to run those games. And you're like, oh, I was hoping to try that game out. Here's my ticket. Off you go. So it's the room for you didn't plan ahead. You don't have a ticket. It's a really high traffic convention. Just show up here and you'll play something. Um, I'm so busy this year. I don't think I'm gonna have a chance to do that. And I would imagine even that might be swamped this year. Uh, so on the one hand, again, I would tell you, especially during the lonely years, like Gen Con in some ways was most moving in like 2010, 2011, 2012, when we were kind of at the bottom of the role-playing game industry. And attendance, I think, gosh, might have been around 40,000 one of those years, half of what it is now. So when you showed up to Gen Con and you were like, people are wearing D&D shirts, my people, it's a gathering of the tribe. Now the tribe is just so big you feel like it's everywhere, which is great in some ways, but it has lost that kind of elite frisson of
Yeah.
being a thing only a few people do. But man, we've talked 15 minutes and I still haven't answered your first question, which is, what are my seminars at Gen Con?
Yeah, one quick thing before you do that. It's interesting for me to listen to you talk about, the size of Gen Con. And of course, I've seen pictures of it, and I have actually, I did cover the the annual firefighters convention in Indianapolis about 20 years ago. But anyway, so I know how large that facility is. Man, my head is not working today. Oh, well, I just thought it was interesting. Just something. I don't know how many folks have read the book Game Wizards by John Peterson, who we're going to be having on the show within the next few shortly. Well, one of the things that I think is interesting is at the end of many of those chapters, he always lists because Gary Gygax always had kind of he always wanted to be beating the Origins convention, which is a wargaming convention, if I'm not mistaken, run by Avalon Hill. And every year in the 1970s and early 1980s, he would, at the end of the chapter, because Gary was so to give you an idea of like, what direction kind of the game playing public was going in. Always, Gary Gygax was, I guess, kind of like obsessed with always having more people at GenCon than in Origins. It's funny to me that like, well, Gary, you definitely did at some point win, although I think that's probably more due to the efforts of Peter Atkins and necessarily than Gary Gygax, although certainly created the game that started a lot of this. What was I reading recently? Oh, I know, I was reading Crown and Skull, a new tabletop. We're never going to get to your answer about what you're running. Oh, we should. Really quickly, I thought it was interesting, tabletop role-play games. I usually bought the RPG Crown and Skull. Um,
What's
now
what is that RPG?
Oh, and this people that make this is a gentleman who's a cool looking dude. I'm looking it up. It's by Runehammer Games, and I can't remember the gentleman's name who runs this. Let's see if I can find it. I'm looking at the about page, and of course, this person has to be way too. And it was Roomhammer Games. I was gonna say they owe a kickback to Professor Dungeon Master because he's the one who was like made me look at this game. It's really interesting. But I was reading the rules. It's a fun. I actually would recommend. It's a really really interesting style game. It's definitely an OSR style game. It has one of the most interesting mechanics is there's no hit points. The more damage you take, you start losing skills, then you lose equipment, and then you're gone, which I think is kind of an interesting mechanic. But the reason I'm bringing Runehammer up is I was reading the introduction to it and it was like tabletop role-play games have been around since like the 1960s, and it's funny because there is and if anybody from Runehammer might call me out on this, but I get a sense that the Runehammer folks are Arneson fans because there's it's interesting. We talked about like practice, but you get a sense that the the philosophy behind this is that tabletop role-playing games weren't necessarily codified with Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s, even though they were commercially codified, that this had been a practice that was going on. And I think there's actually a good argument that you could make for that. Not necessarily one that I would always buy. Ben, what are you running at Gen Con?
So, at Gen Con, I'm gonna only talk about my history panels, and if you want to come to my writing panels, go to events and type in Ben Riggs. I just don't want to list everything. I will throw So I'm only going to read to you non-sold out panels. um Thursday at 10 a.m. I'm in a writers panel called Here's How That Went, where writers post-mortem their own processes. Um Thursday 6 p.m. I'm at a writers meet and greet. Friday at 2 p.m. and I'm really uh this is the writing panel that is the writing panel I care the most about. It's called Writing Geeky Nonfiction, which of course, hopefully I'm the guy to talk about writing geeky nonfiction. So please come to that panel. I can't believe that is not sold out. Um, there's a That's sold out. That's sold out. Unbelievably to me, my Battle for the Soul of D&D panel is not sold out at Saturday at 11 a.m.
Who's
That
on
is
that panel?
me.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
Thank you. That is the one where I'm going to talk to you about my research for my next book. In summary, I would tell you that we are lucky actually that things haven't been rockier than they have been. They've been pretty rocky with Wizards of the Coast, because ever since Chris Cox took over Wizards of the Coast in 2016, um, he has had been trying to corpify essentially Wizards of the Coast in a lot of ways, and his influence on D&D has in the main been malign. He is the person responsible for the OGL crisis of a year and a half ago. And I detail in that panel what I have found so far in my researches in the past year about this struggle kind of between the people at the bottom of the ladder at Wizards who are closest to the fans and actually make the products, and those at the top of the pyramid at Wizards who are simply demanding that the line go up, all else be damned. And that is Saturday at 11 a.m. At noon, I'm doing my Golden Age of Role-Playing Games is Dead panel. We'll see how that goes. Hopefully nobody shows up to fling things at me.
Cool.
And at 4 p.m. on Saturday, I'm doing a signing in the hall. Sunday at 11 a.m., I have a panel called Relationships Between Writers and Editors. Again, if you're really into the writing, please come to that. And I wanted to mention something that pivot off something you just said, which was about Professor Dungeon Master. Um, if you don't know Professor Dungeon Master, he has a YouTube channel called Dungeon Craft. And he is really hot to trot on there's going to be no more D&D books. There's not going to be any publishing will end. Like we're like it's going to become some walled garden and a subscription service and it's all going to be online and digital. And he is really alarmist about it. And uh Chris Cox, the CEO, who I myself am kind of painting as a villain, emerged from his den in Rhode Island these over the past few days to appear on Jim Cramer's Mad Money show. They released their I think first quarter profits from this year in the past few days, and Chris Cox said that that Hasbro is pivoting to be a digital business. And of course, Professor Dungeon Master is like, see, there's gonna be no more D&D books. The sky is falling. And I'm listening to this, and I'm like, oh God, I'm gonna email him, and I'm gonna say, hey, you want to make a bet on that? I bet in 10 years that there still will be D&D books. Like, how much Professor Dungeon Master do we need to wager here to make this a bet you think you can win? Where I say, as of 2034, there's still gonna be books and you are saying there's not. Because again, I was like, when I talked to Chris Perkins and Jeremy Crawford last month, again, we didn't talk about this specifically, but here they are spending all this time making new books, and it certainly seemed like they're there to make books, and that's what they do at Wizards is they make books with rules in them. And I'm kind of like I just think Professor DM is just wrong, is what I'm thinking. And then I get an email from a former employee at Wizards who I'm not going to name yet just because I haven't fact checked this. But in addition to Chris Cox, other people, I guess calling them villains is a little bit much. I guess I'm comfortable calling Chris Cox a villain. Let's call them suits. Like other suits involved in D&D over the past years, people who want the line to go up and want to see profit more than art, have been Cynthia Williams, who was the CEO of Wizards after Chris Cox, and she went and hired a bunch of people from Amazon, one of whom took control of the D&D team, and who I'm also anonymizing until I fact check things. But I've decided to name him for now Sergeant Harvard because he was in the Marines, and guess where he went to school? Harvard. So Sergeant Harvard would force the D&D team into these weekly business reviews. And I've had these weekly meetings with Sergeant Harvard described as the Christians being thrown to lions. So I contacted a former Wizards employee and I was like, okay, what does it mean really? Christians being thrown to lions. It's very vivid. But like what kind of hellish meeting was this? And this former employee responded to say this. about these weekly business reviews with Sergeant Harvard. Quote, and I'm just reading this letter to me aloud now. It's more accurate to say that Sergeant Harvard had a specific agenda going into weekly business reviews. He wanted to prove that a digital games as a service model was superior to our antiquated books business. He used that forum to publicly attack me and several other old school WotC folks and promote the people he had brought in with him. The weekly business review gave him a weekly forum to advance that agenda. Um, Sergeant Harvard had a specific format he wanted for weekly business review reporting, a numbers dense spreadsheet that no one could read because everything was so small. Each week, he fawned over two of his hires, both colleagues from previous jobs, tripping over himself to compliment their prowess at delivering exactly what he wanted to see, even though his preferred format lacked context and flavor. Make it bigger, we can't read it, became the refrain from others in attendance. Despite the fact that those requests got louder and rowdier each week, Sergeant Harvard never wavered from his dedication to his format or his praise for his acolytes. Um, and this format he's using is specific to a digital business. Um, my source adds, quote, uh, Sergeant Harvard simply didn't have any experience shipping physical books to distributors who then shipped to retailers, and he wasn't interested in that part of the business, end quote. So it's funny to me that as I'm like getting my guts all up to kind of argue against Professor Dungeon Master, what do I get? The very next day in my inbox is a source from Inside Wizards saying, "Oh yeah, the guy in charge of D&D not interested in physical books at all." And I would go on to add that he fired almost everyone involved in physical book production in December of 2023. So even though, I really want to argue against Professor Dungeon Master, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is our grim future. Again, maybe this is where things get worse. When you get a digital guy who has no interest in producing books in charge of a game that is rules produced in physical books. And yeah, like, I'm interested in digital too. Again, I want Wizards to make money and make great products. If they make some digital tool that's so amazing that we all want to use it, that's great. But I think that what we're all afraid of is that there's going to be an attempt to lead us like a steer by a nose ring from one trough to the other and say, "Eat, animal." And we certainly don't want that, you know. Uh,
Does D&D Beyond have any? Oh my gosh, I'm yeah. I mean, I have has there been any news on the virtual tabletop from Dungeons and Dragons? I mean, I think one of the things that I just want to say is that I think we're going to be moving away from Wizards of the Coast as being basically the vanguard, at least for design. I mean, there's so many independent designers making interesting games. I do run 5e. And that group is really kind of locked in on 5e. And I think, actually the plan after finishing Strahd is to then do the Eberron campaign. It doesn't matter. But my point was, there's so many, Crown and Skull to Shadow Dark to, the folks making the old school essentials. I just, maybe Wizards of the Coast is going to corner the digital market, and maybe that's going to be enough for them. And I mean, folks like me probably aren't going to be that interested. I do run on Roll20 because I run games for a lot of my friends, back on the West Coast. But even then, I don't know. Where's the virtual tabletop for D&D and all this? Because to me, I would think that would be the cornerstone of any kind of business model. Because the one thing I can't get away with, because I'm not a member of D&D Beyond, I don't quite get it. I mean, I guess it's nice to save your characters on that. At the same time, I do understand Roll20 because I do need a virtual tabletop. We use Discord for voice like almost everybody else does. I feel like I haven't heard any news recently about virtual tabletop. Have you?
so they tried it out. They had some influencers play it. There are videos on YouTube. Again, I'm not super interested
Yeah.
in this, so I
Hmm.
didn't watch
Yeah.
them. So I'm sure members of the audience know more than we do about it. But again, the reports were, it seems fine. I want to say that one of the concerns was they were running it on like top of the line machines.
Sure.
And one of the questions was, well, how is this going to run on my $200 laptop that's 10 years old? And the answer was, which is not encouraging. Um, but again, I like to reserve judgment on
Yeah,
products until they arrive. Like again,
yeah.
I feel like uh the world is filled with people telling you what they think about 2024 D&D, but it's not going on sale until Thursday at Gen Con. Um, but I'm also not going to rush and get it at Gen Con because again, if anything, I feel like you and I should rush into counter programming,
Ugh.
but that's a separate thing. Uh, but no, like there's clearly a D&D digital tabletop that's coming. And based on all of this, they're gonna uh I have been saying reserve judgment, but that email is uh confirming all the worst alarms of Professor Dungeon Master and others. Again, Professor Dungeon Master, like I pretty much watch every video, so he's one I'm very comfortable being in a sort of dialogue with. Um, and like I said, I guess they're right, which is bad. I feel like maybe I should put this in my the golden age of our role playing games as dead panel. Um, because I just ultimately, it's not that I want a book over a digital product. My fear is that digital product is just not going to be a role-playing game in the way that we understand them to be role-playing games. And I think that while it's easy to say that design will go other places, the problem is that D&D is the leader in the category, and D&D is the biggest actor in the space and is the best at getting people into the hobby. So if like what if the Yankees just stopped playing baseball and decided to start playing rugby instead? What is the effect on the game of baseball when one of the marquee teams that is probably responsible for getting thousands of people across the country into the game of baseball decides to play rugby instead? Like, it seems like it's bad for the hobby. And I feel the same way about Dungeons and Dragons. Again, people have accused me of being like a D&D lover or something like that, and I'm like, no, it's just that they're the door, they're the biggest gateway. If you ask people how did you start playing role-playing games, 90% are going to say D&D. So if D&D messes up how to get people into role-playing games and stops making role-playing games, it is bad for us. Um, but hey, 10 years ago, they almost licensed D&D to Fantasy Flight Games. The sales of D&D were so bad, they were almost like, hey, let's just license this out to Fantasy Flight Games, and they can do it. And again, if that were the end point of all this, that wouldn't be a terrible thing. Like if a company that really wanted to make a tabletop role-playing game got a
Mhm.
D&D licensing deal, that's fine. Uh, as, as a matter of fact, someone should tell Hasbro that. Like, hey guys, just license the whole brand away. You don't need to worry about it anymore. But again, the thing is they want it to be $1 billion brand, right? They want to make it bigger, but I don't think they know how to do it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think there's something to be said for the folks that, yeah, the upper tiers of Wizards of the Coast looking at the cultural cachet that something like Dungeons and Dragons has and being like, how are we not making more money? I mean, like the classic Cynthia Williams quote that this is an under monetized product. In some ways, I don't entirely disagree with her. In some ways, I also would say that's kind of one of the nice from you, certainly from a player's perspective, one of the nice things is this is a different like the fact that this is a product. I'm sorry, there's that this is a social practice that is difficult to monetize to me is a feature, not a bug, right? But again, I'm not being paid to make money off of Dungeons and Dragons. But like, isn't that a wonderful thing? The fact that anybody can loudly, and there's tons of people that are like, where we even put that border between like when you're just going outside and playing something. I've said this before. To me, the rules, the mechanics, but just as we're about to reading, the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's always interesting to me. The thing that's revolutionary about tabletop role-playing games has nothing to do with rules or mechanics, but literally it's the permission to play make-believe as kids, right? We codified into ways. It's interesting to me that, in these rule systems that we read from the mechanics, it's like somehow it's all about saying, see, you're not just going outside and pretending that you're monsters and heroes, outside in the lawn with a wooden sword and the top of a a garbage can or whatever. Like we've got math here, so it's socially acceptable now for you to do this. Although it certainly wasn't in the 1970s, 1980s, even as a 13-year-old. But we digress. But I guess my point is, isn't this wonderful? I think this is one of the things that we should be celebrating around Dungeons and Dragons. Is like that's again, it's one of the things I think is fantastic about it is you can't necessarily monetize something that anybody can do with a PC with a pen and paper or even without.
So I'll briefly say a thing I say all the time, which is, Wizards, call me about this one. The key to making D&D into a billion-dollar brand is making it easier to run for dungeon masters. Like everybody focuses on the players
Well,
because they
yeah.
buy, there are more of them. So if you want to make money, make stuff for the players. In some of the promos for D&D 2024, Jeremy Crawford has been like, monsters will hate this, DMs will hate this. This is a rule that's, like gonna make things cool for the players. And I can understand why you would say that and why that's kind of a cool marketing thing because it's saying to every player, those 10 million people with D&D Beyond accounts, you have to buy D&D 24 because it's going to be cool. But to the 1 or 2 million DMs out there, that certainly
Hmm.
sounds like, oh God, I have to read all these rules again. Like I have to figure it all out again.
Well,
Like
I
there,
think that, yeah, I mean, I think the technology that Wizards of Coast should be
yeah.
investing in more than necessarily virtual tabletops or even, D&D Beyond is artificial intelligence, because I think that, and I don't say this with any type of love, although Skynet, if you're out there, I for one welcome my new Android overlord. But I do think that I was talking with this with my wife just the other day. I'm like, I do think in 10 years there's going to be AI-driven Dungeons and Dragons games. I think it's maybe even earlier than that, because I think AI in many ways is kind of perfectly suited to do this, right? Once it can kind of understand the concepts of like how it's kind of managing. The problem, of course, is AI won't be able to manage the folks around a table. But if you've got, I mean, what happens? What happens to the hobby if you can if you can jump onto a a website that will have a dungeon master just for you? What I think is scarier is how it could necessarily splinter the 4 or 5 person gaming groups that we have right now, when you can kind of get that fixed many ways the same way that you do with like a solo computer role-playing game. It's even more sophisticated. Especially what if an AI can also simulate other players at the table, which I think is coming as well, right? Um, is there something that we specifically get from having other people at the table? I'd like to think so, but I think it would be really interesting if you could play. I mean, imagine this for a second, this is a thought experiment. If you could play 5e right now, even if it's just a text space, I don't think it would be like, old classic interactive text adventure, but you could sit down and you could write what your thing does, and it's simulating other players at a table, and then it's doing it, and it's using 5e rules. That might have a significant impact on the way that we are currently doing a social practice of tabletop role-playing games. I think AI is the future and that's where I think if Wizards Coast wants to make money, access to the best dungeon mastering AIs, and they have to come up with a really fancy name for. What was the name? It was the fourth edition where they had the big mega mind brain in a jar or something that they're from Magic.
It's a Magic the Gathering card called
Yeah.
Gleemax.
You taught me about that, and then I was obsessed for like 2 days on that thing. Oh, the past is such a strange place, isn't it?
So, um, for the past year, I've been running a One Ring campaign, and it just ended about 2 weeks ago. At least this arc of the campaign did. But I had ChatGPT up basically the whole time. So someone is being sworn in as the like king of not Bree, but Lake Town. Hey, ChatGPT, quick, generate an oath for that. It does, and it's pretty good. Um, hey, ChatGPT, they are traveling through Rohan. Can you give me 10 random encounters? Four of these are good. That's fine. Off we go. Um, and just that, like an AI adventure generator. Because D&D runs pretty well on random tables anyway. Like the first AI D&D adventure generator where you as a DM can just log in and it's just helping you at the table. Like that alone, I think would be huge. I can't believe that Scott, these conversations are so fruitful. Again, Wizards of the Coast. If no one is working on this right now, please go work on it. Because that is the ultimate DM tool, right? Like having an AI there just to help you out. You're still the face, you're still gathering with your friends, having a good time, but it makes almost everything easier for you. Um, like that would be incredible because like that One Ring campaign would not have been nearly as good without ChatGPT in my back pocket helping me out. Like oh, you want to go into the tombs in Moria. Okay. Give me, hey, ChatGPT, give me 5 dead dwarves in Moria and give me some poems that are on their graves. Boom, it does it. And again, of the 5, 2 or 3 are good. So, okay, there's 3 graves down here, not 5. Sorry. Um, I do want to move back to one thing you said though about dice. Um, and playing make believe. There was a period where I was absolutely fascinated by dice as tools of the suspension of disbelief. Because, what is it that separates D&D from cowboys and oppressed Native Americans? Is very clearly uh, the dice. And in some ways, by assigning a probability to a thing, it makes it seem realistic, and that realism overcomes all the goofiness of, well, I shouldn't say all the goofiness because D&D is very goofy at times too, but it makes you believe it's real in some way, and it ties back to a thing we talk about all the time, is the Dungeon Master's Guide as a kind of wisdom text, right? The Dungeon Master's Guide, which if you are listening to us for the first time, we have not even opened yet. We've been talking for almost an hour. um, but these D&D books were supposed to in some ways codify a world, and when you encountered them early in puberty, there's nothing you wanted more in the world, at least nothing I wanted more in the world, than a single book that broke down reality for me into bite-sized chunks. Oh, just read this book and you'll understand a reality even if it's not ours. Well, that seems like really crucial information. Here I come, second edition player's handbook. Let's read all about it. um all right. We have
Well,
we
I'm
didn't even
sorry.
start. No, please say
I
something. This is amazing.
I
We
know
have
because that's the problem, of course, is that some of the folks out there, if you think this is a carefully curated podcast, we often just go on these well, like you said, we have rolled for digressions, right?
we're an
This whole
extemporaneous
podcast, but
podcast. I think again,
yeah.
I think it's one of our features, not flaws, but continue.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking a lot recently. I grew up in a military household. I was a military kid. We moved all over the place, and I'm also an only child. And the reason I give you that exposition is not because this is a therapy podcast, but as much as it is, I think a lot around how, especially this is probably true. It doesn't matter what your background is, but how much you kind of believed the the forms of authority in your life when you were much younger. You thought that everybody, if there's no quick way to explain basically what the how you get wisdom out of life is that you eventually understand that absolutely nobody knows what they're doing, right? But when you were a kid, you really did think that there were like systems in place that were to keep the, I think about all the time that when I was growing up as a kid, especially in like elementary school, that like, oh, we don't fight wars anymore, we don't have racism and these things. Like, that's fantastic to study these things as history, but thank goodness we've overcome all of those things. Of course, you get old, you realize that certainly with a couple of those issues that they're very much sadly, live and well. We certainly do fight wars. We still don't know exactly what we're doing. If those of you who are following the current political campaigns are even more literally aware that there's quite a few people who have no idea what they're doing, but I digress. But I think a lot around how when I was a
Way to keep
kid.
that politically vague.
I know. I do have some strong political opinions. If you'd like to hear about them, give us $3 and you can ask me on Discord. But I digress, right? But the point is, like, as a kid, I really did believe in authority structure. Like, I did. If I read a book, I think it's always funny. Like, don't believe everything you read. When I was a kid, I believed everything I read. Thankfully, I suppose I read that. What, absolutely, we're completely entangled. There you go. That's your first drink, folks. That you're very much entangled with the type of media that made you, right? And of course, so very much the person that I am is very much reflective of the type of early science fiction. My favorite writer is Ray Bradbury. If I've never said that, to me, my outlook on life is extremely Bradburian. Um, and because those were early influences. But I think about how when I was reading things about how I took everything kind of for granted and realized like this is what it is. I didn't have the I'm very different now where at 51 years old, you read something and you're like, okay, that's their perspective. You read something through kind of like everyone a lens trying to glean exactly what truth you have, knowing that everybody has like these different, priors that are very much based into their worldview that you have to take into account. Especially, I mean, we made a joke about politicalness, but especially in this day and age where we've got very polarized, kind of strange little channels, you have to look at everything through I shouldn't say you have to be aware of what the subjective lens of the person that you're listening to is. My point is this, I'm going to bring it back to tabletop role-playing games. One of the things that I think is really, really interesting is again, even as old as I am now, those type of embedded perspectives that I built as a kid are still very much a part of me. And so when we read, it's not always just nostalgia when we read the Player's Handbook or the Dungeon Master's Guide. I still view these texts, and I'm sure there's other grognards that are, and then I also think there's other folks that are my age that actually view them very differently. I'm thinking about one of my friends very much who kind of looks at this stuff and he finds it fun, but he's like, oh my gosh, game design has advanced so much. Why would you ever read that book? It's kind of absurd, to think about that book as a form of like a good way to learn Dungeons and Dragons. But when I read it, it's still like, how do I put this? Like, it's still it's like I still view it when we read the Dungeon Master's Guide, I still view it as like, this is how it's done. Everybody's been, like they figured it out back then. And again, that's not based on whether on any type of objective truth, not that there is anything that is objective truth, but so much of that is still filtered through the who I was when I originally picked up these books. So when I pick up these books, it still is like, it's funny, we call this Bible text. And I don't want to stay too long on the religious iconography or the religious thought, but they do still feel a bit like sacred text because there is still that kid in me because I still read these books as when I did as a kid. I still think this is how you play Dungeons and Dragons. This is what it is. So like every edition past then is like, well, like they're playing with this, but don't they understand that it's already been set in stone? Because part of me is still that kid that sees these books in the same way that I did when I was 10, as this is the way you play, like this is the actual way. And I've been thinking about that a lot, about how much it colors my experience of like newer versions of Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah, I'd say it's probably, there's probably 60% nostalgia for the way we used to play, but also 40% of that one kid who read it initially in that perspective of, no, they figured out role playing the very first time they did it.
Well, and it's interesting because again, I don't have a nostalgic link to first edition at all.
Yeah.
And this is the first like, when we read it aloud, it's the first time I'm reading it most of the time. So I approach it, you know, uh, like I might approach early plays translated from Greek or something like that, where I'm like, okay, you know,
I
okay,
like that the edition I've read up for you is like the editions of antiquity.
pre
It's they were written in Latin back then. Yeah,
before
kidding.
Sophocles,
Yeah, right.
pre-Sophoclean tragedy is the way I kind of approach this. It's like because one of the things that's interesting to me is the style of play has changed
Yeah,
in the past 10 years, and it's gone very much, I think, away from a tactical war game style to an improvisational theatrical style. And that again, if you're gaming with someone under 40 or under 30, they're almost certain to use funny voices,
yeah, yep.
give their character a proper name that they actually care about, not Hungar the Barbarian, unless you really like the name Hungar the Barbarian. But there's this theatrical acting that Gygax called it play acting, and he spoke
Hmm.
against it, and
Yep,
he was wrong. Like getting rid of the war game roots is what has allowed D&D to take off in many ways.
yep.
So it's really interesting to see uh to view first edition as an artifact of play where he is describing what he does at the table in these books. And what he does is really ticky-tacky and rulesy, and oh my gosh! And again, there's if you like playing that way, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. But again, I just don't. I have no nostalgia for these texts, which maybe that's why this works out so well. Between you and I, because we both have such a different experience of these books. Anyway, we should probably end show.
Wait, we
So
have to read from this book. Oh
so
no, what have we
I
done?
do want to say this very quickly. So if this is your first time listening to us, this is a representative episode where we sit down and we're like, oh, we're going to read from the DMG. Up, we just had such a good conversation. We didn't get to it this week. Is a thing that happens. And I can tell you right now, the title of this show is going to be something about Wizards of the Coast and weekly meetings being like Christians being thrown to lions. So hey, come back next week and we'll actually read from the book, and we will be just as interesting as when we're dunking on Wizards of the Coast this week. So with that, Scott, you want to tell us about the Patreon?
Yeah, absolutely. If you do like this So this podcast is made, and I truly mean this, is made possible by our Patreon supporters. If you like the podcast, very much encourage you to do that. Again, we're still in the soft launch phase of reading D&D aloud. You guys may know that we kind of migrated from a previous podcast. I think September 1st is our concept for the hard launch. The Patreon is going to be having some big changes coming up soon, so maybe you want to get on the ground floor now. But for $3, which yeah, well, which is I was gonna try to come up with some kind of strange metaphor
It's like
rather
a
than
coffee at Starbucks.
I know that's so. But can't we come to something that's like, what's a tabletop role playing game equivalent for a small glass of tiki grog at your local? I don't know. At any rate, $3 is nothing, right? We live in an age where everything is inflated, and we're still stuck at $3. So, absolutely would love to have you join us on Patreon. It also does give you access to the Discord, where we talk quite a bit, and where we talk yeah. And shortly, I feel like comfortable announcing this for the next couple of months. One of the things about the new Patreon launch is that we will actually be having an official reading D&D aloud game, and for certain Patreon levels, you'll be able to have access to that game.
Well, and
So
I want to
I'm looking forward
throw
to that.
I want to throw one other thing out, which is I've recorded a lot of me doing seminars at conventions,
Right. Yes.
and soon those will also be available to Patreon subscribers. Like, should be in the next week. That something will be available. And this is good stuff. Like my seminar on 4th edition from last year at Gen Con, which I haven't released. I'll release that via the Patreon. The Battle for the Soul of D&D seminar that I'm doing at Gen Con, I will record that and release that on the Patreon. And we're going to aim for one a month. So for $3, you are, and I would tell you that is primo A+ content. This is like, this is an extemporaneous podcast. My seminars I take weeks to write them. Again, I'm interviewing people. They are like mini book chapters that you get to hear now. So I highly recommend joining the Patreon so you can get access to those. Again, one a month, probably for the next 6 to 8 months until I run out of material. We'll be releasing those. So
I imagine that Wizards of the Coast is going to give you plenty more material to write another book about within the
oh
next
my God.
year, right?
Let me tell you, this week it became clear book 2 will be even better than book 1. It just became clear. You can find us on Libsyn, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. We're going to get up on YouTube Music at some point, even though YouTube Music sucks terribly. We have coming up interviews with John Peterson, Jason Tondro of Wizards of the Coast about their OD&D book. So we're reading that book right now, and we're going to interview them about it after we've read some significant portion of it. I can't say the whole thing since it's the size of a dictionary, but if you want to be able to enjoy that as a kind of book club, I would recommend buying their $100 doorstopper and reading something of it.
That is an enormous book. I put it on my I got it yesterday, and I put it on my bedside table, and I was like, I'm not sure my bedside table because it's a really interesting book. I know we're running out of time, but boy, we should talk about that soon. Also, want to say that in the next few weeks we're going to have Dr. Thomas Malaby, who is the chair of the anthropology department in the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee. He's rather famous for writing a really fascinating article called Beyond Play, that kind of examines the relationship between game and play, very much around the social practice of what tabletop role-playing games is on. So I've had the chance to work with Dr. Malaby for a while, but I'm actually really interested to hear what he has to say. And he's also in my Strahd game, so it's going to be really interesting to hear what he has to say as well. So that's another one that's coming up as well.
All right, great. Then with that, I'm going to say I'm Ben Riggs.
I am Dr. Scott M. Pruner.
Thank you all so much for being here. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, Excelsior. See you then.